G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today I'm joined by Albert Wong to continue my discussion on the book The Forgotten, Chinese Labour Corps and the Chinese Anzacs in the Great War. Albert was captivated by the story of The Forgotten when Will first told Albert about his research findings. Today we talk to Albert about the journey they undertook during the process of researching and publishing this book. Hi Albert, welcome to the show.
Hi Adam, how are you?
Good, thank you, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. So Albert, just to start with, so prior to collaborating with Will, you point out in the book that you had not gone looking for this story. Do you think that because the story of the AIF mainly focuses on the service of the Australians of European heritage, that you were simply unaware that they had also been soldiers of Chinese heritage serving in the AIF?
Well, firstly, great to meet you, Adam, and thank you for having us. I think I'm a bit of a fatalist. I think meeting Will was a fateful moment in my life, really by a chance, an introduction through a mutual friend, our famous Wallaby Captain Nick Farr-Jones. And Will approached me and said, look, I'd like you to read this. You know, he gave me a couple of pages to read, and it was the story or the plight of the Chinese Labour Corps, CLC. And really, they were, as Will described to me, when Britain and France were in battle with Germany at the early stages of the Great War, Britain and France reached out to China to say, send some troops and assist with the Allied efforts in battling Germany, to which China refrained at that stage. They wanted to be independent. But what China did agree to do was send across some laborers. And the numbers vary between 120,000, 200,000, that sort of range. And these were basically coolies, cheap labor from the province of Shandong. And they were paid a pittance. I think it was roughly £1 a day. And they assisted behind the front lines, you know, digging trenches, laying rail lines, caring for the injured, loading munitions, and so on. And about, again, the numbers vary, but somewhere between 15 and 20, 30,000 perished from collateral damage, you know, disease, sickness, starvation, and so on. And Will came across these people during his battlefield tours of the Western Front, and he would come across these odd graves with Chinese headstones, and he thought, they look a bit out of place, what are they doing here? And he did his research, and that's how he learned about the Chinese Labour Corps. And I suppose maybe I was Chinese, ethnic. He approached me to say, look, you know, I thought someone should put up a brass plaque for these poor forgotten souls who sacrificed and gave service in the cause, and we should try and remember them. So that's how this story started off. I don't claim to be a big history buff or a historian, but Will really opened my eyes to it.
Given that you were unaware of the extent of the service of Australian soldiers of Chinese heritage, did you know of any of your family members or their friends who served in the AIF during your research? And did you discover the service of any family members that fought?
Well, look, just coming back, yes, in answering that question, Adam, I suppose when Will brought the plight of the Chinese laborers to my attention, it sort of piqued my interest a little bit, not that much. I then went back and asked my, at the time, 90-year-old mum, dear mum, who is an educated woman, went to school, university. She was a school teacher at one stage. And I said, do you know about the Chinese laborers, the plight of the Chinese Labour Corps? She goes, never heard about it, didn't know anything about it. And I started asking other people, and basically 9 out of 10 people knew nothing about it. And I said to Will, look, you know, I'm in two minds about this. Maybe we should do a little bit more research. And as we were doing our research, we took a trip down to Melbourne and went to the Chinese Museum there. And we learned all about the Chinese Anzacs. And that really struck a chord with me. And that was when we really got into it. And then eventually I said to Will, look, rather than, you know, raising a few bucks and putting up a brass plaque for the Chinese laborers, why don't I commission you to write a book about the Chinese laborers and about the Chinese Anzacs, because that really, took my interest. Being a proud Australian, I say that because I took up citizenship in 1977 or 78, and I've lived in this country for 45, 46 years now, so my roots are here. I thought I didn't know anything about the Chinese Anzacs, and even though I have always recognized the Anzac Day as a sacred day in our annual calendar, I had, prior to 2019, never attended an Anzac Day memorial service. Not because I don't recognize its significance in our history and what it means and what it stands for, but I never felt a sense of belonging, I felt like a stranger, an outsider, if I had rocked up to an Anzac Day memorial service. But knowing this, what I call the missing chapter in history, I thought, well, I do have some sense of ownership. And, I'm very proud to attend an Anzac Day memorial service now. And given the changing population mix in our country as well, I think Australia had a population of, 10 or 12 million back in the mid-70s, whereas now our population is 25 million, and I think 1.5% of our population is of Chinese ethnicity. I thought it was important that this story is shared amongst the populace at large, but in particular, it should be shared with the new migrants and the new Chinese Australians that are living in this country. Why? Because I think with the knowledge of this history, I think they can better assimilate and integrate into Australian society, adopt our values, and preserve our values. I also fear that some of our Australian values are being eroded over time. So for all those reasons and more, I thought it was important that we collaborated and created this book.
Absolutely. So as you research the involvement of the Chinese Labour Corps, what aspects about their service did you personally find the most challenging and confronting, and why was the reason they were challenging and confronting for you?
Well, I suppose it's confronting. War is confronting, be it whether you're a soldier on the front lines or whether you're a labourer working behind the front lines. And, these people were treated fairly badly and paid virtually nothing for it. I think, yet they sacrificed as much as any other party in the war and weren't given any real recognition at the end of the war. I thought it was important that we try and do our little part to share their story, shed some light on their plight. And, I think I'll just divert slightly, but, I mentioned the Pantheon de la Guerre. So there's a link at the end of the book in the postscript section, I think, where you can see it. The Pantheon de la Guerre is the largest man-created painting, oil painting, ever in history. And it was commissioned by, I think, the French government at the beginning of the war, and it was completed shortly before the armistice at the end of the war. And it was the idea of the painting was to capture all the participants in this great war. It stood, I think, something like 3 or 4 meters in height, and it was 150 meters long. It was the length of a football field. It was huge. Don't quote my exact figures on it, but it was a huge painting, and obviously it was painted in sections. And the Chinese laborers were in there as well as part of the participants in this great war. But towards the end of the war, when the Americans participated, there was no room left on the canvas to fit them in. So the Chinese laborers were literally painted out or painted over to accommodate the Americans. Now, this painting was put on exhibition after the war ended at the Paris Fair, and for years millions and millions of visitors saw it. It was in a circular form. It was so big. It was a round painting, and it was exhibited till the, I think, mid-30s, and then it was sort of rolled up and forgotten and left to rot in a field somewhere. And then a wily old American spotted it and I think acquired it for the princely sum of $3,000, shipped it back to America, and had the painting restored. And as I said, it was in pieces, the canvas. And now the Americans are at center stage of this painting, and the painting is exhibited at the Kansas City Museum, I understand. So that's the history of the Pantheon de la Guerre. But as I said, again, the Chinese laborers were forgotten, and I don't mean to digress from our conversation, but I think it's a very interesting part of the history.
It's a very key point that you touch on, Albert, and I think you're right. The Chinese Labour Corps were on that painting, and then they were painted over. And look, we don't get into the difference between countries and all that sort of thing, but I think you're right. They were painted out of history. And that is a key point. They were painted and forgotten of their contribution to the war. And the book that you and Will have written is giving back some history that it was forgotten, but it's now back in the frame. So I think it's a very good point that you touch on.
Yes, I mean, I don't begrudge what happened. History is history. The times are different. Were different then, and the times are different now, and the times will continue to evolve. But I think having that knowledge now, I thought it was important. If we had the opportunity to share that story, we should, and that's what Will and I have done. So I'm very, very pleased about that.
Absolutely. In your studies that you did with Will in the book, did you travel to the Western Front to see the graves of the labourers?
Not yet. It's on my bucket list. I've put my hand up to join Will for one of his Western Front tours. And I suppose if it weren't for COVID last year, we probably would have done it by now. But yes, it's something that I will be doing for sure.
Stories of the Chinese Labour Corps and service of soldiers of Chinese heritage are largely unknown by the Australian public. Is that also the case within the Chinese community in Australia?
I believe so, and that's only with my limited knowledge. And again, that is part of our history. It's nothing to be ashamed of, because you can't stray away from the facts. But, in the early 1900s, when the Great War broke out, we had the White Australia policy in Australia. Even though there were quite a lot of Chinese living here at the time, I think, in fact, the percentage of Chinese in Australia was far higher, given the much smaller population back then than it is today. And that's really a remnant of the gold rush from the mid-1800s. And a lot of the Chinese that came here for the gold rush remained, and a lot of them intermarried with the local indigenous people, as well as the Irish potato farmers and so on. And when the war started and they were looking for healthy, fit young men to enlist, the law at the time, or the rules at the time, were that you had to be of substantially European descent in order to enlist. So if you looked like Charlie Chan, you weren't going to make the grade or make the cut. And so even though a lot of Chinese ethnic Australians wanted to go and fight for their country or their adopted home, they were initially turned down. But of course, as the war continued and casualties mounted and good, fit, healthy young men were sort of in short supply, I think they started to relax the rules somewhat. And so I think it was around 300 odd Chinese ethnic Australians or Chinese Australians were able to enroll and went off to fight the good fight. So, when you look back at history, I think, almost 280,000 Australians in the Australian Imperial Force. 300 out of that many is a drop in the ocean. It's nothing, and that's understandable why it's a missing chapter in our history. It's not very relevant and easily forgotten. I don't believe it was done on purpose or omitted on purpose, but I think it was insignificant. However, knowing this knowledge now and knowing how the population mix has changed in our country, both Will and I felt it was important that this missing chapter in our history, this unknown story, be told and shared.
Absolutely. So was there any particular AAF soldier of Chinese heritage whose story particularly inspired you, and why?
Look, there are quite a few in the book, but I think the one that stands out for me is Billy Singh. Billy Singh was an unknown, he was a short, I think he was only 5'4". He was a short young man I think he had a Shanghainese father and an Australian mother, a Caucasian mother. And anyway, he enlisted and he became a much decorated sniper. And he came back from the war as a hero back in his Queensland town. But heroes are there one day and forgotten the next, and died as a pauper in an unmarked grave. Very sad, but a really beautiful story. And I believe a film was actually made, or a documentary was actually made about Billy Singh, but the director who produced the film decided to choose a Caucasian actor as Billy Singh rather than an Asian or a Chinese actor. But I think, look, it doesn't matter, the story is told, and that's the important thing, that the story is told and shared and recognized.
Absolutely, and I've recently seen, Albert, that they've given Billy now, he's got a lovely memorial. His actual headstone is a beautiful memorial to him. He's finally getting the recognition that he deserves, he thoroughly deserves. Do you feel as though the book Will and you have written is, in Australian sense, it's correcting, and I know you touched about it with the previously about the omission. Do you feel that it's correcting an omission of Australian military history about the ethnic composition of the AIF by bringing to the attention of not only the public but fellow historians a subject that has largely been ignored?
Well, as I said, I wouldn't call it an omission, but I suppose what the book attempts to do is shine a light on a chapter of history which is either unknown or relatively unknown. And I think, it also shines a light at the background. Will did a wonderful job. It's not just about the war, but the history about China, how it got to where it was before it engaged in the war, and the long history of Chinese involvement in this country, in Australia. From the traders to the fortune seekers who came out here for the gold rush, and the influence that the Chinese have had in Australia or on Australians, and vice versa, the influence of Australians and how they've influenced the Chinese, from the traders down at the market gardens and taking on the department stores here in Sydney at the time, Mark Foy's, David Jones, Anthony Horton's, and how some of these traders went back to Hong Kong and China and set up department stores, like the Guion department store, the Sincere department store, that they all came from Australia. And, a term that I picked up from my very early days in living in Sydney in Australia was the Australian vernacular fair dinkum. And, most people would think that's a typical true blue Australian term. But where did it originate from? Well, one school of thought is that fair dinkum came from the Chinese, the gold rush, because dinkum, means fair dinkum, someone's genuine, authentic, or something's real, it's bona fide. Well, dinkum in Chinese means real gold. And it's really a sound derivation of the Chinese word. In Cantonese it's called ding gum, and in Mandarin it's jin gin. But ding gum, a lot of them came, they spoke, they're southerners, they spoke Cantonese. Ding gum means real gold. So fair dinkum, this is real gold.
Wow, that's an interesting... I didn't know that. They say you learn something new every day, and I've learned something new. So for you, Albert, how are the Chinese Labour Corps, how are they remembered in China today? Is there much known about them in China today?
There isn't, actually. And which is why I insisted on the book being translated into Chinese and published in both English and Chinese, which would hopefully encourage some of the newer Australians, some that may not be as well-versed in the English language, that they can still read it and learn the story about the Chinese labourers and the Chinese Anzacs.
Because I think, Albert, what you just said, I think it's key that China should be, they should be very proud of these men that went and volunteered to go and be labourers and help in the war effort. They should be remembered and their story should be told.
100%. I mean, we've done this for all the reasons that I had mentioned earlier. There's nothing political about it at all. And to the extent that before the book was published, we actually provided a draft copy of the manuscript to the Chinese ambassador, saying that this is what we're doing, please review it, let us know if there's anything that we've misconstrued here or out of place. We want to make sure we don't wish to offend anyone with this book. And they were very gracious. They came back, they loved the book, and in fact, I had email exchanges with the ambassador's representative that they would be very happy to come along to the book launch. Of course, we didn't have the book launch because of COVID. We did have a virtual book launch, but we didn't have a physical book launch. And one of the attachés at the Chinese embassy contacted me saying that, would we be interested in having the book published in China? And I said, naturally, would be very interested in having that done. And a potential publisher was introduced and a draft contract was sent over. But then, as I said, COVID came along, and of course, as we currently stand, the deteriorating political relationships between both our countries, which I hope will be resolved in the longer term, because I think our bonds of friendship and our historical bonds should stand the test of time rather than the short-term fluctuations and disagreements that we may have. So, but as it currently stands, I've been told that unfortunately they're not able to publish anything out of Australia and vice versa. So we'll have to wait. But I think this book will stand the test of time, and it's a story that doesn't have a real time frame on it. It can be told, it should be told, and there will come a time where we will be able to publish the book in China.
Absolutely, and I think that's a key point that you touch on with future generations. They can read this book and know what these men did. Absolutely, I think it's critical. I think it's really, really critical. So well done to you and Will.
Thank you. One last point I'd just like to add. I intimated in my postscript section that although the book is about the Great War or set during the period of World War I, little is mentioned in the history books about World War II and China's role, because the theater of war was mainly focused in Europe, whereas in the Asia-Pacific region, it was really the Japanese that were making overtures about conquering this whole Asia-Pacific Oceania region. And as you know, China sacrificed almost 14 million troops in defending the Japanese surge in the Pacific. As you know, Japanese U-boats entered Sydney Harbour, attacked Darwin, and so on. But I posed the question that, have we ever pondered, if it weren't for the Chinese efforts and the sacrifice in curtailing the Japanese advance, what sort of flag may we be flying here today? So, I mean, you can't rewrite history, you can't change history, but I think it's a little point that's not really recognized again, and I don't know whether many historians have really looked into it. Certainly the Chinese haven't. They've sort of moved on because of the change of power from the Kuomintang to the Communist Party. Post-World War II, they just moved on. But someone should have a look at that. I think that's another story to be told for another day at another time.
Absolutely. So you state in the book previously, while you felt gratitude for the service of those who fought for this country, that you couldn't bring yourself to attend a memorial as you didn't feel a sense of belonging. How has writing the story of the Chinese Labour Corps changed that for you personally?
Oh, it's certainly changed. I'm very proud to attend an Anzac Day memorial service these days, because armed with the knowledge of this unknown chapter in history or missing chapter in history and the role of the Chinese Anzacs and the Chinese laborers, I feel a sense of belonging now that I didn't have previously.
Absolutely, and you should feel that you belong, Albert. So
thank you, Adam.
Do you think that as the stories of the service of other ethnic AIF servicemen becomes more well known, that Anzac Day will become even more relevant for Australians from a diverse range of ethnic backgrounds? And if so, that they will be able to have a sense of belonging as you did on Anzac Day and Remembrance Day?
Absolutely. I think it's important that the history is taught and told, and the lessons of history are learnt. For new migrants, new Australians, why would you choose to live in a new country, and not learn about the history of that country? Then really you have no interest to be here. You need to learn the history, and I think I've mentioned to Dr. Brendan Nelson previously, as well as Peter Dutton. In my opinion, I would be wholly supportive that any new migrant seeking seeking Australian citizenship, should be able to demonstrate that they have done a tour and visited the War Memorial at least once.
Absolutely. I think it's a different perspective too, Albert. Like, it's you coming, it's different hearing that. It adds a new sense of thinking and forward thinking, which I think it's
Well, I mean, it comes with people change, we evolve. I mean, I'm at the ripe old age of 62 now, and these are my views today. But, if I go back 45 years ago to when I first came to this country, and, I probably wouldn't be interested in visiting the War Memorial. I'm probably more interested in going down to Bondi Beach.
Absolutely, and chasing girls, and going for a surf, and it's an amazing when you look back to when you first came to now, and the difference and the life experience. We'll call it life experience.
Sure. But also I've had the privilege and the benefit of witnessing how this country has evolved and changed over the last 45 years. A simple influence, I mean, we are so blessed in this country, the diversity of styles of food and cuisine that we can enjoy in this country. And, having had the benefit and the good fortune of being able to travel around the world quite a bit pre-COVID, nowhere in the world, as far as I'm aware, outside of Asia, Australians are more adept at using chopsticks than almost any other Western country in the world.
Wow, I did not know that. So, yeah, very interesting. So, for you now, and expanding on the last question that I asked you, what does Anzac Day mean for you now, and how did this research and writing the book change your perspective on Anzac Day?
I think Anzac Day is a day to remember the sacrifice made by all those that came before us, and especially the troops who gave the ultimate sacrifice to preserve our freedom and our way of life, our Australian way of life. And I don't think we should ever take that for granted. And we need to take hold of our values. I think some of the things that are going on today, you just wonder. I think some of our diggers would be rolling in their graves. But I don't wish to go into specifics today. But no, I think Anzac Day is a day where we must remember all the values that were fought for, and we have an obligation to preserve those values.
Absolutely hit the nail on the head with what Anzac Day means and what it should mean, and also what Remembrance Day is as well. The people sometimes forget the differences in the two. And in summing up, what do you hope will be the legacy of this book for people today and for future generations of Australia? What do you hope the book achieves?
I hope it will help newcomers to our shores, particularly Asians and Chinese ethnics, but even other migrants from other ethnic backgrounds, a better understanding of our history. And I hope that this book will allow other books to be written and spawn about stories of other ethnic backgrounds and their participation in how Australia's evolved and made up. And
absolutely, and I have to say, Albert, I think you and Will have done a fantastic job with the book. I've read the book. It was a fantastic read, and as I said, that was why I got in contact with yourself and Will in bringing this book to life, and I think you guys should be very, very proud of what you have achieved. So, Albert, thank you so much for coming on True Blue History and telling your story and telling why you wrote The Forgotten, the Chinese Labour Corps and the Chinese Anzacs of the Great War. So, Albert, Wong, thank you very much for coming on True Blue History.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for your interest, Adam.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast on whatever platform you get your podcasts. And if you feel like supporting us, check out our new website, truebluehistory.com, for more great content.